All right, I want to welcome everybody to the Sacramental Charismatic podcast. My name is Luke Garrity. I'm a pastor theologian in Northern California, and I'm joined with my co-host, Wes. Wes, how are you doing?
What's up? Good. How are you, Luke?
You're back in Washington, huh? You're not here in Red Bluff.
Back where the weather is normal and it's nice and it's actually livable. Yep, it's awesome.
Okay. I will allow that because it's true. We are really excited to have a guest with us, Dr. Matthew Taylor. Dr. Taylor, it's really good to have you. We're going to call you Matt, but I do want to recognize that you are an actual doctor in this room. So if we need to get medical attention, we will be getting that. Welcome to the podcast, man.
Thank you for having me, and please do not ask me for medical advice because I will inevitably fail on that front.
Yeah, is there a doctor in the room? Not that kind of doctor.
Not the useful kind of doctor.
I don't know about that. So some of our listeners will be familiar with your work. You had a podcast series that came out called Charismatic Revival Fury, which I just re-listened to it recently, and it's just such a great podcast. But maybe for our listeners who aren't familiar with your work, could you just let us know maybe a short bio? I know you've had some connection to the Vineyard movement, which Wes and I both are a part of. We'd love to hear that.
Yeah, so I grew up evangelical in Southern California, really kind of an evangelical mutt, a little bit of Vineyard, a little bit of EV Free, a little bit of Baptist. And then in college, I got involved with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and came on staff and worked with them doing college ministry for about 7 years. Attended the Anaheim Vineyard actually for a little while I was working for InterVarsity. And then was going to Fuller Seminary, got a master's degree at Fuller. And while I was in seminary and kind of wrapping up my time in ministry, kind of realized I don't think I'm evangelical anymore. That's just not really my theological bent. Migrated over into mainline Protestantism and also decided I wanted to get a PhD in Muslim Christian dialogue. I'd always been kind of fascinated with Islam and just caught so many resonances between the conversations I heard going on among contemporary Muslims and contemporary Christians, and really wanted to understand the similarities and differences that are there. Wrote my first book on Muslim Christian dialogue and on a particular movement called the Salafi movement in the United States post 9/11, and how Salafism became kind of integrated into the landscape of American Islam, using in many ways some of the same styles and paradigms of American evangelicalism, actually. And then I sent the manuscript of that book off to the academic publisher for peer review the morning of January 6, 2021.
Oh,
and
okay. I was another day.
Yeah, just another day. I was like, "Oh, good! I got this weight off my shoulders. It's gonna be a nice day." And of course, I was watching the politics, but it was that had been kind of in the back of my mind because I was trying to wrap up the book. And so watched the Capitol riot and saw just this, in many ways, the 9/11 of American evangelicalism, where evangelical symbols, evangelical theology, evangelical worship and music was used to help fuel an attempted insurrection against our government. And because I was in a bit of a research lull, I just started digging into who were the Christian leaders, what was the theology that was used to fuel this riot? How did these people get on this track? And that led me to studying the New Apostolic Reformation, which I'd been kind of hazily aware of before. But I wound up writing Charismatic Revival Fury because I just realized in the course of researching this, I knew I was going to write a book about it. But I realized in the course of working on that these folks were getting ready to do it again. And by 2022, I was already seeing some of the same patterns that had led to January 6th emerging within those same circles in the lead up to this next election, and realized I need to get this out there, these ideas and this knowledge out there faster than a book is going to be out there. So put together Charismatic Revival Fury. It aired in December of 2022 and January of 2023. And now I've got the book coming out this fall, and it's been a pretty wild ride for the last couple of years trying to talk about these folks in public.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting when your podcast came out. So as you know, Wes and I both have had a lot of discussions publicly about NAR world and a lot of the corresponding influences within the Vineyard movement. And I think there was about a 3-month period of time where I had at least one time a day someone would text me, "Hey, have you listened to Charismatic Revival Fury?" It's like, dude, leave me alone. Who is this guy? But yeah, and then I listened to it and I was like, oh man, the medium is really fascinating. You just said, because like you were working on all this research as an academic, and then a podcast, long form podcast is now one of the quickest ways to disseminate a lot of information. And I found it very fascinating because you use a lot of primary sources, direct quotes, and you can actually hear people in their own words. So it was really, and Wes, you just listened to it recently, right? On your way back home.
Yeah. And I just got to say, I listened to the January 6th podcast that you did, and the opening music and the pastor praying for someone while the worship music is playing and just blessing this guy, calling him a soldier. I literally I wanted to throw up a little bit because it was I was like, oh my gosh, it's ruined so many. Yeah, sorry.
Wes, I thought you were gonna say it reminded me of your church services, but okay. Moving on.
There's a funny backstory. Well, so it's not that funny, more funny, sad backstory to that particular sound clip. The pastor there is a guy named Ren Schuffman, who after January 6th started identifying as an apostle, actually. And in that clip that we play, you can find it online. He's praying for this guy named Philip Bromley, who was actually inside the Capitol, witnessed Ashley Babbitt getting shot, comes out and is traumatized, and Ren Schuffman offers to pray over him while he's shooting a selfie video and prays over Philip Bromley. That video was used in the prosecution of Philip Bromley because he admits in the video that he went into the Capitol. So thank you, Ren Schuffman, for offering prayer ministry and then getting the guy arrested.
Wow. Hey, the Lord works in mysterious ways.
Wow. Well, that is, I think, what we can, maybe plan on doing a little bit in this conversation. I'd love to hear more. So I know you listened to the podcast, Wes, and I talked about NAR. And one of the things that I've found a little challenging in the last, I feel like probably about 8 years, I've been kind of tuned in somewhat to the NAR world just because of the influences that a lot of new Apostolic Reformation types, and maybe that's a way to think about it in a broad umbrella of it. It's been hard to sometimes have conversations because, the NAR folks, I would say, generally are like, no, there's no real actual movement. You can't really define us. Your podcast to me was the nail in the coffin for that argument for me, because from the horse's mouth, it's hard to deny that there's not some type of a thing. But if you could, but you also said one pushback, I guess, maybe on some of our conversation was you don't consider Bethel to be part of the capital NAR. Maybe that's one way to think about it. Could you help us understand, like, what do you think is the NAR? What are some of the theological underpinnings, and what makes Bethel different? And also at the same time, too, maybe they're cousins. Maybe that's one way to think about it. Help us think about that a little bit.
So the NAR, New Apostolic Reformation, is a phrase that is coined in 1996, actually at my alma mater at Fuller Theological Seminary. There was it was another name, and in fact, it's kind of an interesting backstory. There's a professor at Fuller named C. Peter Wagner, who was an expert in church growth, and he became fixated on this phenomenon in this kind of non-denominational charismatic space of contemporary leaders believing that they are apostles and prophets. And there's a long backstory to that idea going back to the latter rain revivals of the 1940s and 1950s. But Wagner is kind of an outsider, and he's observing all of this, and he's kind of intrigued by it. And he believes that this is the growth edge of the modern church. And so in 1996, he convenes this big symposium called the Symposium on what he's then calling the Post-Denominational Church. This was his original idea, was to call it the post-denominational church. And the day he gets there, as they're setting up the conference, a group of leaders from the symposium go to have lunch with Jack Hayford, who's a major Foursquare pastor of the flagship kind of Foursquare Pentecostal church in Los Angeles. And Jack Hayford kind of lights in to Peter Wagner and says, "What are you doing with this phrase, the post-denominational church? You're turning me into a dinosaur. I want to participate in some of the stuff you're doing, but I belong to a denomination. And so don't call it that. And so they're sitting there over lunch and they brainstorm over lunch and somebody throws out the idea, what if we could just call it the New Apostolic Reformation? And they all grab hold of that and then they announce it at the symposium. And that's the inauguration in many ways of the NAR. But it starts out as a theory for Wagner, where he's trying to describe why he thinks this is the real growth edge of the church, what he thinks will inaugurate and lead into a great revival. And he views it as a change in the method of doing church, the way of governing churches, that is on the level of the Protestant Reformation in terms of the sweeping transformation it will bring to global Christianity. But then Wagner actually retires from Fuller Seminary a few years later in 1999 to go and build the New Apostolic Reformation and try to build out and creates a set of networks. So a lot of times people will refer back to that theory of the New Apostolic Reformation and try to throw everyone who seems to fit within that theory as part of the NAR, except that was Wagner's terminology. And many people at the time rejected his theory or rejected his terminology, even as they were participating in some of the same circles and ideas. And so by my definition, I try to restrain my own analysis to call things NAR the actual networks, the actual people who were aligned with Wagner, who used his terminology, who embraced his ideas, because I think otherwise it gets really unwieldy because suddenly you're dealing with theories and ethereal groups of beliefs. And the reality is this independent charismatic or non-denominational charismatic world is very diverse. There's all kinds of different movements. There's all kinds of, even in the 1990s, different groups that are playing around with these ideas of apostles and prophets, some of them in league with Wagner, some of them adjacent to Wagner. And so Bethel was one of these, it's another brand of what it's sometimes called the fivefold ministry, right? It's coming out of Ephesians chapter 4, where the author of Ephesians lists these 5 ministry gifts that Jesus gives to the church, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. But they always put the emphasis on the apostles and prophets because they're like, oh, pastors, teachers, and evangelists.
Yeah, boring.
Boring. Yeah, whatever. We care about the apostles and prophets. So the way that I would frame it, and other people disagree. I'm fine with other people disagree. But the way I would frame it is if you think about concentric circles, the biggest circle would be American Protestantism. The next circle would be kind of Pentecostal charismatic movements. Within that, the independent charismatics or non-denominational charismatics is a particular substrate of the Pentecostal charismatic movements. Within that, there are many, many people who are interested in this apostolic and prophetic movement. And the NAR is one very influential and very controversial set of networks within that broader global apostolic and prophetic movement. And so Bethel would be another network or brand trying to use this fivefold ministry model, build it out and experiment with it and turn it global.
Okay. So go ahead. Wes, go ahead.
I was just thinking, does Bethel also subscribe to the Seven Mountain theology too? And is that overlap as well, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, that's one of the real places of cross-pollination. In fact, Bill Johnson, the apostle of Bethel, co-writes the book, The Seven Mountain Mandate, with Lance Wallnau. I think it comes out in either 2012 or 2013. But Wallnau had started talking about that in 2000. So that idea had been kind of gestating within these NAR networks for more than a decade by the time that book gets written. And even that book it's actually a collected volume, and they're kind of the editors of it. And there's other people like Peter Wagner and Cheon and others who are contributing essays to it's a very short collected volume, but it's a little volume. So no, they have very much subscribed to the Seven Mountains concept. They've tried to downplay that a little bit more recently or try to reinterpret. They've done a lot of attempted rebranding since January 6th, maybe for obvious reasons. But no, the Bethel is, there's overlap. In fact, the real point of overlap is something called the Revival Alliance, which is a coalition of apostolic leaders. It's created, it's actually all people who come out of the Toronto Blessing. It's created in 2008. And so that includes Cheon, who is very much NAR, very, very much mentored by Peter Wagner. We get into him quite a bit in Charismatic Revival Theory. But he kind of creates this thing, but then brings in Bill and Benny Johnson, Randy Clark, the Arnotts, who are the ones who the pastors who were at the Anaheim Vineyard when the Toronto Blessing, or excuse me, the Toronto Vineyard when the Toronto Blessing breaks out. The Heidi Baker and Roland Baker, who are kind of fivefold leaders in Africa with Iris Global, and so Georgian and Winnie Banov are the sixth couple. So it's kind of six couples creating this kind of lateral revival network. And Revival Alliance is itself kind of trying to hold together a bunch of these fivefold brands and movements, and to say, oh, the leaders of these are all work together and are simpatico.
So one question I've got a bit, and I know you talk a little bit, or you in the podcast it comes out, but like I remember it's probably the late 90s when I was kind of started to read a lot of the literature within the Vineyard movement, just kind of about our self-awareness of who we were. The Latter Rain movement, which had been, very influential in like the 30s and 40s amongst Pentecostalism. I just remember when I started reading Latter Rain, it was like 10 years later. It's like, oh, a lot of these ideas are essentially, I mean, they're almost the same overall vibes, I guess. Do you see a correlation between is there any direct influences from speakers, teachers, preachers that are influencing a lot of those folks? Because I think William Branham was the big name in the Latter Rain movement. Does he come up in some of your research for today's modern apostolic folks?
So Branham is a little bit of a complicated figure when it comes to Latter Rain. So Branham was a healing evangelist, a controversial figure in his own time in the 1940s, was one of the first of these kind of itinerant healing evangelists going around the U.S. and Canada, leading these different kind of healing revivals. He leads one in Saskatchewan, Canada. I believe it's in either 1947 or 1948. That then some of the people who are at those meetings, those revival meetings, go and start the Latter Rain movement. But Branham was not actually directly that involved in the Latter Rain. And many of the leaders, and Branham, he really kind of was a fire starter. He kind of he instigated a lot of things, and then he got very controversial and very kind of off kilter in the 1950s. Became more and more racist, more and more misogynistic. Kind of went off, and many of the leaders of the Latter Rain actually wound up denouncing William Branham and viewing him as a heretic. He became very involved in some of these white supremacist networks and kind of creating other movements. So it's again complicated. He kind of inspires the Latter Rain, but then they depart from him. But the Latter Rain it starts in 1948 in Saskatchewan and then spreads really around the world. I mean, even Hillsong Church is downstream of the Latter Rain movement. And because the Latter Rain ideas of this fivefold ministry, apostles and prophets, a grand end times revival, all these ideas are kind of generated within these Latter Rain networks and then spread globally. Very influential in these non-denominational charismatic spaces. And those ideas have been percolating around since the 1950s in American independent charismatic circles and networks. And then what happens is actually in the 1980s, you have this movement that actually comes out of Reformed or Calvinist theology called the Reconstructionists, who pioneer this idea of dominion theology, this very aggressive, Christians need to take over society, take over the world, and fix the world and bring about God's dominion through Christian rule. Those ideas spread into some of these same networks. And the NAR, it kind of emerges out of the confluence of these dominion theology ideas coming from the Reconstructionists and these Latter Rain ideas coming from the more Pentecostal charismatic circles. But again, I mean, even Bethel is playing around with some of the same dominion and Latter Rain ideas. So is the International House of Prayer in Kansas City. I think it's easier to think of this space not as you've got these defined, coherent movements that are all kind of marching together. It's more these loose, highly interwoven and networked groups of leaders who all know each other, all work together. But the way that they think of it is, we've got these different streams that sometimes merge and sometimes depart. And so they have the very fine-grained understandings of, I can work with this person. I'll speak with them at a conference, but I don't agree with them on X, Y, and Z. Right. So it's a world where collaboration does not signal identity. Right. It doesn't mean that just because you're hanging out with somebody or working with somebody, you agree with them 100%, because they all are trying to push forward these revival projects and they're willing to kind of partner with just about anybody so long as they feel like there's some kinship and alignment, and they're willing to forego or set aside some of their real theological disagreements.
Yeah. In theory, that actually sounds kind of mature and healthy, right? Because it's like, we shouldn't have to agree on everything to be able to work together. But at the same time, too, the core theological distinctives and commitments that they have are what probably I'd say were most concerning. But I think that's interesting. When I went to a Reformed seminary for my MDiv, and I remember reading Rushdoony. And then when I was hanging out kind of around some IHOP people, I was like, this is very interesting because it's almost the exact same dominion theology, Christian Reconstructionism, only it's like charismatic and they're speaking in tongues, I guess, that's quite interesting that they've kind of cherry picked from a lot of those sources, I guess. And but go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, well, I just want to say it was actually very intentional on the part of the Reconstructionists. I mean, the Reconstructionists were these high Calvinist, systematic theologians. Everything had to fit together. Everything had to have its place. And then they realized in the late 70s and early 80s that they were not going to be everybody's cup of tea. Right? Not everybody's going to get on board with their whole program. And they recognized that some of these non-denominational charismatic networks were extremely interested in their ideas. And so they started holding a bunch of conferences where they would gather with charismatic leaders, share ideas. And there's a bunch of different forms of dominion theology that get incubated in these charismatic circles. Some of them get called Kingdom Now theology in the 1980s. But they at one point, one of these Reconstructionist leaders actually says at one of these conferences, we, the Reconstructionists, can be the light, and they, the charismatics, can be the heat. Right? We can be the idea people, and they can enact it because they've got the numbers and the energy.
Interesting. So you talk about this. A quote that you say in the podcast is you're kind of talking about there's an observation I've had about the NAR is that there's almost like a hesitation for self-critique or an inability or an unwillingness. And I think part of that is their theology of the honor culture and, yada, yada, yada. But you say, quote, they're deeply networked, but loosely affiliated. And I'm curious why, I understand being willing to work with people that you don't agree with, but what are the things that cause them to, in your estimation, why are they unwilling to publicly come out against some of the things that are either abusive, there's really downstream negative consequences to those ideas or those practices? It just seems like because I think of Todd Bentley is a perfect example where it seemed like everybody was on board, stamp of approval, he's an apostle, and then later they were kind of forced to distance themselves when everything came out. And then I remember Wagner actually, I think, said something along the lines of, I didn't actually stamp my approval on him as an apostle. It was just the move of God. So the language kind of changed from the tent meeting or whatever it was. Because I remember listening to the audio and it was like, this is it. And then it was like, well, maybe he's not. But what's the reason behind that? I guess from your studying.
Maybe I can go back and tell that story a little bit, because it is a fascinating story, and I think it really does illustrate some of the culture these folks are participating in. So the NAR, all these kind of fivefold networks are all fascinated with and in many ways obsessed with this concept of revival and instigating revivals. And so they're magnetized to any time that they think a revival is going to break out. And in 2008, just to kind of set the background, Sarah Palin was mentored by an NAR prophet named Mary Glazier. And 2008 is also right around the time where the Seven Mountains ideas are really getting rolled out as a big campaign in these NAR circles. Peter Wagner writes his landmark book, Dominion, ! It comes out in January of 2008. So they're right at the kind of height of their influence, height of their optimism about being able to change things. And a revival breaks out in Lakeland, Florida. One of the apostles in the NAR, a guy named Stephen Strader in Lakeland, invites Todd Bentley, this revivalist, to come and preach at his church. Fairly standard in a lot of kind of Pentecostal charismatic things. We'll have a week-long revival. But then a real revival breaks out, and you have tens of thousands of people showing up at Lakeland, and this thing goes live. And Todd Bentley is just a caustic, very sketchy character, has a background was incarcerated for a while for juvenile offenses of sexually abusing a minor, is tattooed all over his body, is like on stage pulling women up there and saying, "I'm going to heal your stomach cancer," and kicking them in the stomach. Like, I mean, it is this very edgy, very kind of controversial stuff he's doing. But Stephen Strader is watching all of this, is trying to manage all this, and eventually appeals to Peter Wagner, the head of the NAR, and says, "Hey, we've been doing this thing for 2 months. You said the apostles would back us up when revival broke out. Where are the apostles?" And so this is really divisive in these NAR networks, because Bentley is such a loose cannon, but then they want to kind of be at the forefront of this revival. And so it's actually the Revival Alliance that had just formed that convinces Peter Wagner. They say, "We'll vouch for Bentley. Come and lead this big ceremony." And so they gather this whole group of apostles in Lakeland. They do this live on TV, hundreds of thousands of people watching, to have this apostolic commissioning of Todd Bentley. Che On is there, Peter Wagner's there, even Bill Johnson and some of the Revival Alliance guys are there. And they hold this huge ceremony. They bless him. He falls over and is slain in the spirit with this new anointing as an apostle. And like 2 weeks after that, this scandal breaks out that Todd Bentley has been drunk on stage many nights of the revival and is sleeping with his nanny.
Not drunk in the spirit, to be very
not in the spirit. Well, maybe in the spirit too, but with actual intoxicants, and that he has been sleeping with his nanny and is leaving his family. And this scandal just tears that world apart, because I mean, they have all these people who claim to be prophets who are hearing directly from God. Why did none of the prophets hear anything about Todd Bentley and his foibles, to put it mildly? And so this actually creates this real rift within these NAR networks. Peter Wagner feels very burned by this. He winds up having to clean up this whole mess that he kind of got it into a little bit reluctantly. So I think what that illustrates, though, is that they're so fixated on revival, but they're also fixated on self-promotion. And so what has happened, what has emerged in that world, is a leadership culture that is a little bit like Hollywood, in that you have all these celebrities, these celebrity pastors, celebrity prophets, celebrity apostles who are trying to maintain their own kind of media empires. It's a little bit like Hollywood. It's also a little bit like the mafia, right? They don't want it. Everyone has to kind of stay in line. Everyone has to, you get out of line and you're going to get whacked. Your ministry will be ended. You'll be castigated. And it's also just a little bit chaotic and wild, and they don't quite know how to manage things. And so I think they are in many ways reluctant to pick fights with each other, because they all have very public brands. And so they tend to sweep controversies, tend to sweep conflicts between these apostles and prophets. The actual fights that go on, they sweep them under the carpet. They don't have those publicly. And instead, they put forward a face of unity, even as there's real dissension and controversy and fights going on internally. And I've been in Wagner's archives. He has a massive, massive folder on the Lakeland Revival and all the mess that it created and all of his feelings about it.
Yeah, so it really kind of, it kind of highlights, I guess, the challenge of the self-critique or unwillingness to it, because it's, at the end of the day, it's the bottom dollar. It's the not wanting to lose the conference speaking gigs or the finances that come from all the different resources that get put out by these different ministries. Yeah, very much so. And in many ways, I think I talk about this in Charismatic Revival Theory. There's the authority, because these folks are all presenting themselves as like apostles and prophets with this amazing spiritual authority. It's a little bit of a house of cards, because their power is mutually constitutive. It stays holding up because they all are saying the same thing. They're all saying we're apostles and prophets. If you go in and say, well, that person's not a prophet or that person's not an apostle, then the question is why? Right? Well, what makes them not an apostle? And suddenly, what makes you an apostle with the authority to say that? Or what makes you the prophet? And why should we trust you? Right. So they're all kind of built on the same kind of shaky foundation theologically. Yeah.
And so that means that they all have to kind of band together and not really try to throw too many stones because they're all living in glass houses.
I wanted to ask you about that, and I know we want to talk a little bit about Anaheim Vineyard and Wimber too, but this might tie in a little bit. In your opinion, with all these players, maybe not specifically only NAR, but the loose affiliates, who do you see as like the main players who seem to command the most respect or authority amongst everyone, who seems to be at the top of the pile almost?
Like I said, I think I view, so let me dial it out a little bit, because really what we're talking about now, because today, it's arguable whether the NAR formally exists at all anymore. No, like after Wagner retires in 2010, after the controversy of Lakeland, after the news media starts paying attention to the New Apostolic Reformation, it becomes a thing, and they start criticizing it. And so a lot of people, I mean, this is a world that has no traditions, right? Everything's always moving, everything's always changing. It's a world that has the memory of a goldfish. And so everyone just drops the phrase New Apostolic Reformation. They stop using it, and it just kind of fades into memory. But then the relationships are still there, the beliefs are still there, the networks are still there, but they stop calling themselves NAR. But really, they're existing in this soup of an independent, charismatic leadership culture that they are very influential thought leaders within. And like I said, I think it's kind of like Hollywood, in that you have kind of A-list celebrities in that world, kind of B-list celebrities and C-list celebrities. So like Todd Bentley was kind of a C-list celebrity who suddenly gets catapulted to A-list status through this this Lakeland revival. The major leaders today who are very prominent, who came out of these NAR circles, we get into quite a few of them in my book and in Charismatic Revival Theory. Dutch Sheets, Lance Wallnau, Che On, Cindy Jacobs. We don't talk as much about Chuck Pierce, but he's very prominent, a very prominent disciple of Peter Wagner's. Robert Henderson. And then you've got a whole cast of characters who are kind of on the edges of the NAR, kind of on the periphery. So like Mike Bickle was involved for a while in some of the prophetic circles of the NAR. And then you've got these other brands that are advancing. So you got Gateway Church with Robert Morris, who has gotten into some of his own scandals. Hillsong is not NAR, but they're also downstream of Latter Rain. Bethel is out there kind of doing their kind of Bethel empire building, mostly built around kind of their worship music and their apostolic network that they're building out. So it's a marketplace where all these people are kind of trying to advance their individual brands, but also coalesce into these other kind of more mega brands that then they can utilize for political power or building out their networks or kind of rising in fame altogether.
Yeah, and I think the other part, we haven't touched on this and we probably won't get into today, but then you've got the political aspect or the political side to it. And the first thing that comes to mind is that picture of all those evangelical leaders in Trump's office, and you've got Hillsong in there. You've got a whole bunch of these mixtures that I've never seen with any other president. And there's all these loose affiliations coming together around a political power. And so it seems like from listening to your stuff, it sort of moves from not only an ecclesial theological thing to now it's really entering the political domain. And you've got guys like Sean Feucht, who comes out of Bethel. And so maybe a lot of people go, oh, Bethel, Sean Feucht, and he's really leaning into the political aspect of this and all of that. So yeah, it's just really interesting how it's evolved. And that seems to be what you're saying. It's sort of evolved, and yeah.
That's kind of, I mean, that's part of the reason why I think there's a lot of concerns about the Seven Mountain mandate stuff, which it was interesting when you were talking about that earlier. I was just thinking about how when I was teaching at a YWAM base hermeneutics classes years ago, and somebody gave me a book, and I think it was called The Old Testament Template. I think that was the name of it, but it was essentially Seven Mountains theology, which I know you had mentioned in the podcast. There is a connection to YWAM's founder and Bill Bright kind of having this idea. And it's fascinating because I think, in its, I don't know what, there's a part of me that's like, yeah, I think you even say this on the podcast, followers of Jesus wanting to have influence in all different areas of society totally makes sense. Being a salt, it's the The part that gets really super concerning to me is the forced, like forcing society to then adhere to whatever, I guess ethical or moral convictions are at that time. Okay. Because it seems like it changes at times, but then also the part of the manipulation and the authority, because that's the NAR stuff that's been so concerning for me, is the forced authority. Like, you have to align yourself under my quote unquote apostolic leadership, which kind of brings me to this question I've got for you in regard to, or maybe this is a concern, is it's interesting to me how all these folks are so focused on authority, but they're so unwilling to actually wield any when it comes to leaders that are operating in harmful or destructive processes. And Alan Scott is a person I think that would be the first person to come to mind, because it's been very frustrating for me, and I think for Wes and for a lot of people in the Vineyard, where are these apostles and prophets that are out there? Because I know there's been conversations. I know they know about it. I also know for a fact that many of the people who are in the NAR Bethel circles are not fans of what's happened, and yet no one will come forward and say anything. Why? It's just so baffling, And again, bottom dollar. I don't think it's unreasonable to see that as being. It seems like there's no other reasonable explanation as to why people are hesitant. There's no really good theological reason. There's no really good reason other than there seems to be like a unwillingness to lose your influence or not have access to that network for your fundraising schemes. Is that kind of what you've observed too as well?
Yeah, there's a great article just came out this last week by a Zimbabwean scholar named Josiah Taru. I think I'm pronouncing that right. He's a scholar. He's I think an economic anthropologist is his field, but he's looking at these prophets, these fivefold prophets in Africa, and the way that they are accumulating social and moral and spiritual capital. And then the way that they interact with politics. And I think it's instructive in many ways, because we see the same process happening in the United States right now, especially around Donald Trump, that there's I talk about it in Charismatic Revival Theory and in my book as a sort of a spiritual oligarchy model of church governance, right? It's not authoritarian in the sense that there's only one person at the top. It's that there's this class, this echelon of apostles and prophets at the top, who are all kind of banding together and choosing not to compete with each other so that they can divvy up the landscape, divvy up all these churches and then kind of take over the whole landscape. And so that oligarchy is self-protective, right? Again, because for reasons of there being kind of a house of cards that if one you take out one of those cards, what happens to the rest? But they're all friends. Like, they all hang out together. And so a lot of these leaders have not spoken out about Mike Bickle and his sexual abuse because they're all friends of his. A lot of them have not spoken out about Robert Morris and his sexual abuse because they're all friends of his, right? And they don't want to upset the apple cart of their own oligarchic authority. So yes, there is a lot of it's social capital, it's influence, it's political capital. Now today they become extremely influential politically. Many of these fivefold leaders have direct connections into the Trump administration, the Trump campaigns. They are frontline leaders in trying to mobilize votes for Donald Trump right now. Maybe just to give you a little of the backstory on how that happened, because I think it's a fascinating backstory. Donald Trump has, for the last more than 20 years, has had Paula White Cain as his personal pastor. He called her out of the blue in 2002. Paula White Cain is a white, independent, charismatic televangelist, apostle, megachurch pastor who actually came up in Black Pentecostalism, was mentored by T.D. Jakes. Today is her apostolic father or spiritual father is an apostle in Ghana named Nicholas Duncan Williams. But then she was kind of hanging out with Trump for a number of years. He called her out of the blue in 2002 and they became friends. She bought a condo in Trump Tower. And when Trump decides he's going to run in 2015, he reaches out to Paula White. At the time, she became Paula White Cain a year later, and says, would you be my liaison to the evangelicals? But she doesn't know the mainstream evangelical. She doesn't know your James Dobson types. So she starts inviting the people that she knows to meet with Trump at Trump Tower. And Wes, this is where you start to see these pictures of religious leaders surrounding Trump, laying hands on him, blessing him, prophesying over him, is at some of these meetings in the fall of 2015 at Trump Tower, convened by Paula White. And Lance Wallnau, the guy who originates the Seven Mountains concept, is in those meetings. He's one of the first Christian leaders to endorse Trump. You also have people like Kenneth Copeland and some of these like word of faith, prosperity gospel televangelists in those meetings. And the people who are at some of those meetings become the inner core of Trump's evangelical advisors. And they become very influential in the Trump administration in terms of setting policy, but also in terms of doing outreach and also orchestrating spiritual warfare on behalf of Donald Trump. And all of those forces then converge on January 6th. And many of the same leaders who are deeply involved in the Trump administration become deeply involved in mobilizing for January 6th.
You know, that's so interesting because I think it was when Palin became the vice presidential nomination. At that time, I think she kind of she distanced herself from the Pentecostal church. You remember that time? Because I remember it was all over the news. And because at that time, so it was that 2000, 2007, 8.
2008, yeah.
Yeah, so it was like Pentecostals were still not mainstream enough. Us charismatics were like, they're suspicious. Right, because prior to that, Bush or even Clinton, any president was always trying to date the evangelical, conservative evangelicals, and now it's cool to be Pentecostal already in that world. So what a change! Could we talk a little bit about? I'd like to bring up Wimber because I know you've done. You did a really great. I think it was episode 1. Did a good job of kind of summarizing Wimber's, I think, ideas, legacy a bit too. And then within the Vineyard movement, for those of us who have been around for a long time, we know that Wagner and Wimber were friends, and yet they had significant departure on some very, not just biblical theological things, but some practical pastoral. I think that was definitely a concern for Wimber, was some pastoral implications to Wagner's ideas. Help us understand, like, what was the departure? Because Wimber he wrote a book, a article, which I know you're aware of, the Fivefold Ministry. You could take that article right now and apply it to any one of these NAR downstream cousins, whatever you want to call it, and it would fit. Still to this day, I think it's one of the most helpful articles that we charismatics could actually look to. Flesh that out a little bit. What are some of the differences? Help us understand maybe the history there, and your evaluation as to why Wimber didn't win that influential, I guess, controversy.
So Wimber, for those who are not familiar with him, John Wimber was a member of the band that became the Righteous Brothers, but he left before they took on that name, and he converts to Christianity, becomes this very dynamic pastor, first in kind of the Quaker world in Southern California, and in the 1970s he actually goes to Fuller Seminary and takes some classes under Peter Wagner, and Wagner is just drawn to Wimber. I mean, Wimber, Wagner's an expert in church growth, and he sees Wimber and he's like, that man is a bona fide practitioner of church growth, right? Everything that Wimber touches, suddenly, like, he'll be leading a Bible study and it starts out like 5 people, and in 3 months it's 100 people, right? And he starts a church that's 100 people, and in a few months it's thousands of people, right? So like Wimber is just this magnetic, charismatic personality, and actually Wagner hires Wimber to do some of these trainings in church growth. They work together in the 70s, and so Wagner will kind of do the theory, and then Wimber will lead the practicality. And then Wimber leaves Fuller and goes and helps to kind of found the Anaheim Vineyard. And then Wagner says he wants to really kind of push the envelope at Fuller. And so he asks Wimber to come help teach this class called the course number is MC 510, which if you're ever around Fuller, people still talk about MC 510. But
infamous class.
It is infamous. I mean, it gets written up in all these magazines. I mean, but the title of the course is Signs, Wonders, and Church Growth.
Yeah.
And so Wagner has Wimber come and teach the course, and Wagner's the professor of record, but he usually sits in the back and just kind of observes and then grades everyone. But Wimber's the one teaching this, and they would do like 2 hours of lecture, and then they would go into the quote unquote clinic, and suddenly Wimber is doing words of knowledge and prophecy and having people come forward to be prayed over for healing, and they're experiencing miracles, and this becomes so controversial at Fuller. I mean, you have hundreds of students, even outsiders from Fuller, trying to audit this course because they all want to get around Wimber and see these signs and wonders. And the Fuller faculty, especially the theology faculty at Fuller, become very concerned because they feel like, what is going on in this course? This is a 4-credit course, right? This is a seminary course. We're a mainstream evangelical seminary, and they're talking about miracles and trying to pray over students in the course. And so eventually the faculty that intervene and shut down after a few years this course. And this really, I think, radicalizes Wagner, because he just decides, I can't trust my colleagues. They don't care about advancing the gospel in a powerful way, and I'm just going to go my own route. And so he and Wimber remained friends for a while after that. But in 1989, Wagner is kind of experimenting further. He wants to go past where Wimber is, and he meets Cindy Jacobs. And she starts telling him about apostles and prophets and about these spiritual warfare campaigns to transform nations, very much coming out of these latter rain and dominion ideas. And that's where Wagner starts kind of germinating these ideas of the NAR, is in his relationship with Cindy Jacobs and some of the people that she introduces him to, like Dutch Sheets, like Chuck Pierce. And then it becomes this kind of nucleus of leaders who then kind of pioneer the NAR a few years later. With Wimber, he's watching all this happen, and he's very concerned. And there's a backstory there, too, about the Kansas City prophets and how Wimber got very excited about some of these prophecy ideas in the 1980s and some of these leaders who were around Mike Bickle. And then he got burned pretty bad by them and felt like they had really kind of gone off the rails. And so he's very cautious about this stuff, and especially these like hyperactive spiritual warfare ideas. We're going to conquer principalities and powers, right? He thinks all of that is really round the bend, and he's pretty consistently warning Wagner, sending him letters saying, "Hey, you really need to dial this back. You're getting pretty extreme there." And then Wimber dies in 97, and Peter Wagner organizes a collected volume in 1997-98 called The New Apostolic Churches, and he dedicates it to Wimber and calls him a founder of the New Apostolic Reformation.
Yeah, I remember that.
And so all these people then have pointed to that and said, look, John Wimber is part of the New Apostolic Reformation. That was Peter Wagner trying to revise history and try to loop Wimber and Wimber's charisma and influence into this early NAR. Wimber did not want anything to do with this stuff that Wagner was doing, and in fact decided not to contribute at all to that volume because he was in severe disagreement.
He patently rejected almost every foundational premise within that movement. So are you kind of suggesting that kind of the reason why Wimber's ideas didn't take hold or have as much influence is because he just got co-opted after his death by that crowd who just built? I mean, they didn't really consider his critiques. His paper. I'm shocked at how many Vineyard people, because it was in the Reflection. It was in one of our internal, pastoral magazines. Haven't ever heard of it. There's so many people that are totally unaware, and also seem to have forgotten his interaction with Metro Christian Fellowship at the time too. So is this a case of the winner is whoever survives and gets to just make it? They're part of Wimber's part of our team. Because a lot of, I think, Wes, you had that happen too, where I'll have conversations. Like all my NAR friends or I guess people I know, they love Wimber. They're like, Wimber's the best. Yeah, I'm always like, do you know he doesn't? He's not. No, okay. So is that fair?
They've not been vocally critical of Wimber very much, and in some ways, I think, again, it's a culture, a leadership culture that has the memory of a goldfish, and so they remember what they want to remember, and so they remember, Wimber vouched for the Kansas City prophets, Wimber worked with Wagner, right? They'll remember the parts they want to remember, and some of the NAR leaders also came out of the Toronto Blessing. Like Che On and Lou Engle were very influenced by the Toronto Blessing. And they actually affiliated their church, that what becomes Harvest Rock Church, that is the Cheon's church today.
Yeah, it was a vineyard.
It was founded as a non-denom, joined the vineyard during the Toronto Blessing, and then got kicked out of the vineyard because of the Toronto Blessing, right? And so there's this way that like these schisms and fractures, they want to kind of iron those over and paper those over and say like, no, there was this kind of perfect continuity between all these different groups and all these different movements. The reality was much more complex and relationally fraught.
Interesting. Yeah. That's kind of, I mean, it's kind of, in some ways it's kind of funny and it's also tragic, but yeah, I don't know.
Well, and then the irony of Alan Scott taking some of these fivefold apostolic and prophetic ideas, and I mean, I don't want to be too strong in my phrasing, but hijacking Wimber's own church, the Anaheim Vineyard, the mothership of the vineyard, and turning it into one of these NAR adjacent kind of fivefold churches. There's an irony and also just a real, I would say, tragedy to that.
Yeah.
And you can look at how that congregation has responded, and especially the people who had been around during the Wimber era, and just the devastation that has caused in that community. And I think that is epitomizes in many ways the trend of how these more autocratic, authoritarian style leaders have just been kind of riding roughshod over a lot of churches and kind of forcing them into models that are quite destructive.
Yeah, and I was going to say, you could actually see the progression of Alan turning. At first, I thought, I was like convinced he was angling the church and moving it to become a Bethel, but I was short-sighted in how much he wanted his own thing. And that's exactly what you talk about, is like they each want their own slice of the pie. And that's what Alan actually ended up doing. He moved it to, because he probably saw this becoming the start of his own mega probably movement, was probably what he was envisioning, that was working adjacent. And you could see all the people he was inviting to speak, and everyone started going, these, we're not like, we know them, but it's like these speakers are not, very vineyard theology and practice. And it started getting really and evolving until it got to the point where he left. So yeah, I it's interesting hearing what you've said and seeing that play out exactly in the Anaheim Vineyard and now the dwelling place with Alan.
Yeah, and that's very much kind of what the dark genius of Peter Wagner is, finding a way to get these to herd cats functionally, right? So you've got all these apostles and prophets who are all big personalities who all want to have their own little mini empires, but he finds a way to create a framework that they can all work together, all partner together, still have enough autonomy to feel like I've got my little fiefdom that I control, but I'm not competing or fighting. I'm friends with all these other fiefdom leaders and all these other emperors, but they all get to kind of run their own thing, and they're not accountable. They're not accountable to anyone.
Yeah, that's the. I mean, I think one of the most concerning parts of this whole thing. But contrasting Wimber with all these apostolic leaders, I think I've listened to some. There was I think it was in Kansas City. No, maybe it was. No, it might have been in St. Louis. There was a vineyard conference, and Wimber had Wagner at it, and it was really interesting because I think it was one of Wagner's, hey, I'm going to give you the 10 ways to grow your church. I mean, like, one of the things I just remember was make sure to have your church's parking lot full. So if you have two cars, both the man and the woman should drive their cars and park them, because it'll look like there's something going on and people are going to come to check out your church. It's all that type of stuff. And there's a lot of church growth stuff that can be very helpful for churches, but that was one of the ones that was but it was like classic Wimber after, a day of this stuff, where he gets up and he's like, I basically don't agree with anything that he just said. Let's go to lunch. It was just like, classic Wimber. Or when Ravenhill spoke at a Vineyard conference, national conference, and it was, super heavy holiness, revivalistic, it's very much the hyper Pentecostal, neo-Pentecostal maybe side of things. Same thing. Wimber did not have a problem clarifying, like, he did not that's not us. Like we can, he famously would say things like eat the meat, spit out the bones, or he would trim the trees, which, I think sometimes maybe we should have not let the trees grow. But there was a willingness on his part to not have a problem. He wasn't afraid of controversy or having, a conflict a bit. Yeah. And I that's one of the reasons why I really respect his just leadership, the genius of it at that time. And just seems like that's no longer at all, or I should say it's less present in a charismatic world nowadays, where there's almost like there's not a lot of courage.
I would also say what set Wimber apart from a lot of these folks was he was willing to draw lines. He was willing to say this far and no further. And Wagner and his cohort were the group that kept saying further, further, further. In fact, with his inner circle, Wagner's phrase that he would always say to them is, I want you to go further and farther than I ever have. And so the impulse behind the NAR is always, we're just going to keep pushing. We're just going to keep driving forward. And we're going to leave a lot of bodies in our wake, but we're going to bring about the kingdom of God. Right. And so I think their impulse that they believe they can bring about the kingdom of God in many ways through worldly means, through church growth, through these strategies, through apostles and prophets. And at some point, maybe they don't need God. Maybe they don't need God to do this thing because they've got their apostles and they've got their authority and they can cast out the demons. And I think Wimber just always maintained a sense of propriety, of humility, of like, I'm just a dude, right? I'm just a guy. I'm just in the flow. I'm just trying to do God's work. And some things you just got to cut off. Some things you just got to say no to.
Interesting. Yeah. You mentioned you have some connection to Anaheim. You went there for a number of years at the Anaheim Vineyard.
A few years. I was living in Orange County at the time. My brother was quite involved at Anaheim Vineyard, and he invited me, and so I attended there for a couple of years. I wasn't deeply involved, but I attended.
So when Lance was pastoring,
yes,
I guess I'm just kind of curious. So we've been kind of involved, as you know, I've been pretty involved with a lot of the Anaheim debacle. A lot of friends there I have personally spoke to. We've had on this podcast, a lot of different victims of Alan Scott's spiritual abuse. Just from your perspective, I know you're on the East Coast, you're not in Orange County anymore, but, have you witnessed some of the devastation from that too? And I'm kind of curious, like what's been your observations from that as well?
I've mostly been following it at a distance, just through the news coverage and different blogs that people have had. And so I'm not in the weeds on everything that's gone down there. Like I said, my brother actually knows quite a few more of the leaders who were have been involved, and he would be a much better person to get into the details with. But I do find it very much fits the pattern. The reality is these apostolic networks have really pitched themselves in a very powerful way in this charismatic space to say, hey, wouldn't you love to not be handcuffed to your denomination? Wouldn't you love to go and you as a pastor or you as a leadership team can get involved in our revivalist network, and you can be a part of this global extraordinary work of God, and you can participate in this cutting edge thing, and we are the authentic model of church governance. And I mean, like, they've really pitched themselves as like, this is the biblical model. And my view as somebody who's not particularly charismatic, I'm not anti-charismatic. That's just not my bent. I as somebody who looks at the entirety of global Christianity and Christian history, church governance is not a matter of orthodoxy and heresy. There's all kinds of models of church governance in the New Testament. There's all kinds of models of church governance throughout church history. And to get hung up and say, like, this is the only biblical model is, to me, just foolishness. Even the leaders in the early church were disagreeing about how to govern and how to organize these things. And we all want to impose this mythological unity on early Christianity that says all of these people, all the apostles were always in agreement. Read the New Testament. They were fighting with each other, right? Like James and Paul disagree about very important things, right? That you can't really reconcile them, I don't think. And so I think we need to just accept that Christianity has always been contentious. Christianity has always had debates and arguments. There's always been a plurality of opinions. And if we want to restore something, then we are almost inevitably restoring a mythological past that never actually existed.
Yeah. And part of it is, I think, like they hang that carrot, right? They dangle that carrot of like sustained revival. If you want that, and it's very much a narrow definition of what revival is, then you have to have this apostolic alignment. Otherwise you won't get that. Yeah. It's too bad. Well, it's been really, I think, helpful. I want to ask you one last question, and then I want you to talk a little bit about what we can look forward to coming out from you. So I call NAR, I'm using NAR as the blanket umbrella term for anybody who subscribes to fivefold in a particular interpretation of apostles and prophets at the top, a lot of authority, sustained revival, wanting to, have dominion theology, seven mountain stuff. But you're kind of saying, hey, there is this NAR thing, which is a real thing. Cindy Jacobs, Che Ann, Peter Wagner, and then there's these outside connected cousins or networks. What do you suggest as terms to describe these people? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I would say the NAR is part of this global apostolic and prophetic movement, or fivefold ministry movement. It extends far beyond the boundaries of what any of the networks Wagner even touched. And I mean, some of the Wagner networks have fallen into disuse and disrepair. They've been disbanded. Some of them still exist and have mutated and evolved over time. But really, I think of the NAR in many ways as a set of thought leaders within that apostolic and prophetic movement who have also been instrumental in pulling that movement far deeper into American and other national politics. And the fivefold ministry movement, I think, always had a political edge, but there's a lot of different forms of this fivefold stuff that have proliferated around the world in all these different contexts. But the NAR, I think, have been pioneers in shaping a particular political vision and saying we can transform nations through this apostolic and prophetic governance and through the seven mountains. And really, they have facilitated and encouraged an ambition for global conquest within that fivefold ministry movement that I think has been very deleterious, not only to the movement, but to societies. I mean, many of the same leaders that I profile in Charismatic Revival Fury, who were, I call them in my book, the principal theological architects of the Capitol riot. Many of those same leaders were heavily involved in the Brasilia Capitol riots that happened a year after January 6th.
Okay.
In the capital of Brazil, as Jair Bolsonaro, who also cultivated many of these apostolic leaders in Brazil. And it was in many ways a parallel to Trump in trying to use this independent charismatic world as a source of political leverage. Many of those same leaders who were supporting Donald Trump and instigating the Capitol riot were also helping with this Brasilia attempted insurrection.
Okay.
I think there's this authoritarian impulse that has taken hold from these folks where they've given up on democracy in some sense. Unless democracy gives them what they want, unless democracy fulfills as they view it the will of God, they think they know the will of God because they've got prophets. We're going to do what God's telling us to do, and democracy be damned. And that leaves me very concerned as we head into another election season.
So
these folks are heavily involved right now in torpedoing our very electoral systems and going after seeing Trump inaugurated again. And if Trump loses, I think they're ready to wreak havoc again.
So the global apostolic and prophetic fivefold ministry movement, that's the new term. Dr. Taylor has coined it. We're going to go with that. Wes, did you have a final thought?
No, I just thank you so much for coming on. This has just been so fascinating, and it's so much more nuanced, so much more scarier. Actually, I'm actually leaving a bit more scared now. I had an idea, but now I'm like, ooh. So yeah.
Interesting. Hey, so Dr. Taylor, I know you're on Twitter, X, whatever we're going to call it. And I don't know if you're as famous as I am because I have Todd Bentley following me. And I want to let you know that was a very great day. But you have the podcast, which we have a link in the description. So if anybody want to listen to your multiple episode series, Charismatic Revival Theory, they can do that. What you have a book coming out. What else can people do to be able to kind of stay connected to what your work is?
My book is titled The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian Movement That's Threatening Our Democracy. Comes out officially on October 1st. You can pre-order it now on any platforms. And the book really is, for those who've listened to Charismatic Revival Theory, it's kind of the enhanced and expanded version of Charismatic Revival Theory, where I go into much more depth around a lot of these characters and also try to understand this backstory of how these independent charismatics like Paula White, like Sean Foyt, like Dutch Sheets and Lance Wallnau and Cindy Jacobs, who were marginal figures in American evangelicalism in 2015. I mean, they were popular in independent charismatic circles, but in terms of broader evangelicalism, they were nobodies, really, in many ways. But then through Donald Trump and riding Trump's coattails and popularizing their ideas through propagandizing Donald Trump, those ideas have moved into the center of the American religious right. And this independent charismatic style of Christian nationalism really is the ascendant style, both at a local and a national level. And you have you just have right now hundreds of independent charismatic leaders, pastors, apostles, prophets, evangelists, revivalists, worship leaders coming out of the woodwork, getting involved in local politics in very extreme ways, often partnering with militia movements in local spaces in order to push forward their agenda, going after school boards. I mean, it's a rapidly changing and actually very much radicalizing landscape right now around these leaders and these ideas. And I'm trying in the book to kind of trace out how that happened and really where the points of concern are. Because I think a lot of times people get up on their high horse and want to criticize the NAR and say, oh, look how stupid these people are. They believe in apostles and prophets. Or look how stupid these people are. They speak in tongues. Or look how stupid these people are. They think they can conquer the world. And I want to say, look, the reality is these are human beings who have come to these beliefs semi-rationally, and there's a coherence to the set of ideas that they have. I think we need to take them seriously. And I'm fine with people being charismatic. I'm fine with people believing in fivefold ministry and apostles and prophets. Just don't torpedo our democracy while you're doing it.
Yeah. And just, my own self, I consider myself a center right. I'm conservative in most of my politics, but also very concerned about, I'm not, actually really both political parties make me want to give up most of the time, but I'm also deeply concerned about some of these things coming from the far right and the extreme political language coming out of the church too. It's like it's not healthy and it's not good for the church, I think, either at the end of the day. So it is interesting how there's people from a variety of different political backgrounds and commitments and values who have similar concerns about some of these different movements, biblically, theologically, pastorally, and then politically. I find that to be concerning, I guess, or it should raise the alarms a little bit with these movements that have so much influence in the world. So I'm looking for your book's been advertised forever, by the way. I didn't know it was October. So there we go. I'm looking forward to reading that book.
And I'll just say, I'm right now working with a coalition of Pentecostal and charismatic leaders trying to kind of figure out some ways to speak out against violence, against political violence, and against some of these very politicized prophecies that have really fueled a lot of this. So if there are listeners who are pastors or leaders in that world who want to do something, who are like, I'm Pentecostal charismatic and I'm grieved by what I'm seeing happening all around me in my world, reach out to me, and I can connect you in with some of these coalitions that we're trying to form, especially around this election. I think we need Christian leaders of good faith, especially Pentecostal and charismatic Christian leaders of good faith, who can persuade some of these people, who can speak to them and who have authority in that world. I'm not in that world. Like they basically think I'm demonized at this point. So I am, but I want to also positively contribute and help gather some of these leaders and say, no, there are people in this world who are abiding by the teachings of Jesus, who are listening to the gospel and trying to live out the gospel, and who are not getting locked into these dominion ideas of power, and who are trying to speak out against it. And so if people are interested in that, please reach out, and I'd love to connect you with
great.
those
and I think too, what's really important about that in particular is that there are those of us who are I am a charismatic. I have absolutely no problem with using that term as long as I like to define it. But it is a theological identity marker that I have, and so I think that it's important to acknowledge that there are people who are committed to the power, presence of the Holy Spirit, who want to see genuine manifestations or expressions of the charismatic life, who also see the concerns and the danger of this. So I think that'd be great. So people can find you on Twitter. They can find your book coming out in October. We'll have links in the description for all of that. But we really super appreciate you taking the time to be a part of this, Matt. And it really, like I told you, I've been a fan of your Twitter for so long. It's just been cool finally being able to connect.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate getting to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
Thank you.